Holy Father, protect them in your name so that they may be one. Amen. If you knew you were going to die tomorrow, what would you say to your friends? And how would you say it? The last words of Jesus in the Gospel of John are not a linear argument building to a logical conclusion. Instead, they have the form of an ancient rhetorical device called amplification. This speech and all three letters of John share a similar method of cyclical repetition. They employ stark contrasts and hyperbole. They make the difference between light and darkness and love and hate, good and evil, truth and falsehood. And the goal of all these words is to make the love of Christ live in your heart. This is Jesus' prayer for his friends, the ones he loved, the ones who didn't know how they were going on without him. He says, Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. Now, different followers of Jesus have different ideas of what it means to be one. I'm sure that you certainly will encounter many people who believe that being one means thinking and believing all the same things. But I believe that we are one in the way that a family is one. My mother's family first immigrated to North America because my uncle decided that he was going to go to Princeton instead of Oxford. And he was there, he was at Princeton and learned how to play the ukulele. His roommate was from Hawaii, and he played Fats Waller on the piano. And he married an Anglican bishop in Canada, and then had this great career in finance. And when he retired from his career in finance, he did a lot of sailing, and he took up photography. And that was what he was like. My aunt, my mother's sister, however, married someone from the working class. The two of them were evangelized by Mormon missionaries, and she and her husband moved to Heber, Arizona on their advice. And my aunt, her big thing was dietary supplements. So you can imagine the three of them, so different, each of them, and yet they are one family. That's what it means to be one. We don't have to be exactly like one another. We are family. And the calendar of the saints is exactly like that. And then all the images in this cathedral building are like that. So you'll notice the lancet window up there, the window that has St. Margaret of Scotland, a queen. It's massive. And then there's a tiny little plaque below the baptismal font in memory of Jeanette Limerick Bartlett, Julian Bartlett's wife. We have monuments to people, all sorts of people, so different in between. But today what I want to do is I want to talk about a family that you may not have noticed, or maybe you have noticed, but it's a collection of images of people in one of our stained glass windows, the theological reform window. So one of those people is a Lutheran theologian, another is a Roman Catholic theologian, and the third is a Jewish philosopher. And their names are Paul Tillich, Karl Rauner, and Martin Buber. So that's what the sermon's about, those three people today. And by the way, if you're watching on television, we have a few guests here today. Actually, they're not guests, it's their cathedral, but we have volunteers who are going to be preparing for serving next week. And so it's amazing to be actually preaching with people here. It's just, I absolutely love it. But that's what we have here. So we have a sermon about those three characters. Paul Tillich was a friend of Bishop Pike's from his New York City days. And Paul Tillich actually preached here in this cathedral. His father was a conservative pastor, and he was sent away to boarding school when he was 12. And while he was in boarding school at the age of 12, he just found huge comfort in reading the Bible. He was a chaplain in World War I, and saw intense fighting as a chaplain. He was actually awarded the Iron Cross for bravery, and he was also hospitalized for trauma 3 times. And while he was gone, his wife became pregnant with another man's baby. He really began his career as a theologian. He became famous in the 20s, but by the 30s, he started to take a very vocal opposition to the Nazi regime, to Adolf Hitler, and he was removed from his post in 1933. But fortunately, Reinhold Niebuhr, an American, had heard of him and read his work and basically got him a job at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And so he went there at the age of 47, not really knowing English very well, and what he accomplished was truly amazing in his time in America. Tillich, in his first volume of this work, Systematic Theology, described what he called the method of correlation. And what he does is he takes the traditional Christian symbols on the one hand, and he connects them with the modern existential anxiety on the other. And so that's the correlation between the Christian tradition and this modern senses, modern experiences on the other hand. And what he wanted to do was he really wanted to make the case that the Christian tradition is a kind of answer to the problems that modern people face, the anxieties that modern people feel. And so he even translated the words into different words. So he would call God the ground of being. He would call Jesus the new being. He would call sin anxiety. He called grace the process of becoming accepted. Now for Tillich, God is not like a supreme being or a being at all. God is the basis for all creation. All creation depends on him. God is what he calls the ground of being. And the existential problem, the problem that all modern people face, is that the source, and it's the source of our anxiety, is that on the one hand, we have a kind of connection to God. We have a yearning for the infinite, and yet at the same time, we cannot control it. So for Tillich, God is das ganz andere, the wholly other, completely different, completely transcendent, and transpersonal. But God is also personal. And Tillich writes at length about the human experience of doubt as a necessary element of faith. We may have doubts about the personal God that we have a relationship to, but he believes that we can always be sure of the God beyond God, the ground of being. Now, Tillich had a lot of problems, and I love the fact that he cared so much about trying to understand doubt as a modern person, but in his own life, he had such challenges. And I remember in the late 1990s, I heard his son give a lecture, and his son talked about how much his father agonized over whether the things he had done in life were right. And Tillich wrote a sermon about this called "You Are Accepted." And his son said that Tillich really needed to understand that for himself, that he needed to understand that he was accepted. And we, all of us, need to understand that we are accepted too. The second person I want to talk about is Karl Rauner. Rauner called himself so modestly an amateur theologian, but he has thousands of publications, from dictionaries and edited works to his own collected works. He played a central role in the Reformation of Roman Catholicism, the Vatican II councils. And he just in the same way last week I talked about Lectio Divina, a way of praying, so much of his ideas come from an idea of what it means to pray, from his Ignatian spirituality. Unlike Tillich, Karl Rahner didn't believe in systems. He didn't think systems would get us any closer to God. And this is the one quote I'm going to give you from all three of them today. He writes, "What is called knowledge in everyday parlance is only a small island in a vast sea that has not been traveled. It is a floating island, and it might be more familiar to us than the sea, but ultimately it is born by the sea. And only because it is can we be born by it. Hence, the question is this: which do you love more, The small island of your so-called knowledge, or the sea of infinite mystery? Rauner used an expression from Gregory of Nyssa and characterized his theology as a mystagogy. That's an initiation into the mystery of God's grace. So not only is God a mystery for Rauner, but we are a mystery to ourselves. So whenever we think of anything, we think of both the object that we're thinking of, but who we are also matters to that knowledge. And so that's the ultimate mystery that lies at the heart of us. Like Paul Tillich, Karl Rahner also talked about a method of correlation. But for him, one pole was the Christian tradition in the same way Paul Tillich's was, but the other was not Paul Tillich's sense of anxiety or concern about life. The other was this inner experience of God, transcendence, presence in our life, that deep in our consciousness, we have an experience of God. According to Rauner, all people find themselves directed toward an absolute mystery which we cannot control. And that transcendental experience lies at the heart of all religions. So for Rauner, we all really are one. I can't wait till you look at the picture in the windows to see all these characters. The last one is Martin Buber. And Martin Buber came from a long line of very notable rabbis. And when his parents divorced when he was very young, he went and he lived with his grandfather, who was a great, great scholar. But as he became older and started to grow up, he loved German idealistic philosophy like Kant, and he loved Kierkegaard, the Danish theologian Kierkegaard, and he loved Nietzsche. And it really changed his life so that he was much more of a public figure than his grandfather had been. He was engaged in the public world. For a while, at the turn of the 20th century, Buber was involved in the Zionist movement. He was an editor for the Zionist newspaper. But for his whole life, he believed profoundly that the solution to the tensions in the Middle East was a state that was for both Arabs and for Jews, even if that state was one in which Jews were a minority. He would have been horrified by the violence that we see today. He would have been horrified by the mistreatment of Arabs in the Holy Land. When he got into his 30s, again, the German regime changed, and he was removed from his position, and he moved to Israel, where he spent the rest of his life as a great public intellectual and philosophy. Buber really admired the Hasidic ideal of a life lived in the unconditional grace and presence of God. So God being present to us in our everyday life. So everything that we do is a kind of religious experience. He was also influenced by existentialism. And in 1923, he published his most famous book, I and Thou. And in it, he describes two kinds of relationships that we have when we encounter others. And for one thing, he thinks that we become who we are by encountering others. So on the one hand, the I-you relationship is one in which we encounter one another and we recognize the dignity and respect and the unique experience of the other person. We allow that person to be really themselves beyond our ideas of that person. Have you ever had that kind of conversation with somebody where you think you're talking to them and they're not talking to you, they're just talking to their idea of you? That was what he was writing about. In this encounter of mutuality and respect, we meet something that we cannot be measured or turned into a symbol or reproduced. It is practically the way that we actually experience the divine. Now, he points out that I-you relationship is rare. We most often experience one another in an I-it relationship. We regard the other people as objects for our use and for our gratification, as if there was nothing more in the world than our own self, as if our well-being doesn't depend on the independence of other people. In an I-it relationship, we never move beyond our idea of the other. We never really meet the other. It is merely a relationship with our own self. Building on this idea, the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas writes about the demand that another person's face makes on us. And it's part of the reason why masking is so hard for us, because we can't really experience each other in the way that we need to. From a person's expressions on their face, you know something about what they're feeling. And they don't even have control over it, but we know something about them by just looking at their faces. But by the same token, we don't know all that there is. There's a kind of mystery that another person is to us, and it's represented by the human face. So that face for Emmanuel Levinas is like the sacred mystery of God. He calls ethics first philosophy because how we treat a person with a face is far more important than what we think about anything else, what we believe even. Oh, I'm so grateful to have my friends to be able to talk to about these figures with. You may be thinking to yourself, what did these three thinkers share? The horrors of the 20th century is one thing they share, and the existentialist response to that terrible suffering. They all take seriously the modern experience of doubt. And despite this, they have an abiding faith in the transcendence of God, whether it is experienced as Tillich does, as a holiness beyond our anxious questions, or in the way that Rauner does, in that miraculous process of transcending our own self, or in the way that Buber did, in that holy encounter with another person. We're pretty sure that we are not going to die tomorrow. In fact, one might even say that we're going to begin living in a more rich way than we can imagine. I think after COVID, we're going to experience new elements of human life and engagement that is going to surprise us. At in-person worship these last 2 weeks, I've learned something that I'll never forget, and you can never convey just by words. I stand there and I give people the body of Christ as tears are coming down their faces. We've missed being with one another terribly during this time, and we'll never take it for granted again, the importance of the physical presence of one another. This new life that we're about to experience, it's going to have challenges, it's going to have delights. This new life, whether we are Palestinians or Israelis, whether we are evangelicals or whether we are atheists, whether we are supporters of Trump or Biden, we are going to begin to realize that we are one family. We are one